Question 1. Regulatory agencies and administrative rulemaking during a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement. A federal regulatory agency determines that an industry-wide practice presents significant risks to public safety. The agency decides to enact a new rule that imposes stricter compliance requirements on businesses operating in that industry. The agency follows an informal rulemaking process on Administrative Procedure Act, APA, allowing public notice and comment before finalizing the rule. However, an industry trade group challenges the new rule in federal court, arguing that the agency exceeded its statutory authority and did not follow proper procedures. Which of the following would be the most relevant legal basis for the court to evaluate the challenge? A. Chevron deference. The court should defer to the agency's interpretation of the statute as long as it is reasonable. B. Non-delegation doctrine. The court should strike down the rule if the agency was given too much discretion by Congress. C. Hard look review. The court should closely scrutinize whether the agency acted arbitrarily or capriciously. D. Substantial evidence test. The court should uphold the rule if it is supported by enough fact-finding. Answer. C. Hard look review. The court should closely scrutinize whether the agency acted arbitrarily or capriciously. Explanation. This question tests candidates' understanding of judicial review of agency actions under administrative law. The hard look review standard originates from Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association v. State Farm Mutual Automobile Insurance Company, 1983. Under this standard, courts assess whether an agency's decision was arbitrary, capricious, an abuse of discretion, or otherwise not in accordance with the law. 5 U.S.C. SS 706 of the APA. Chevron deference applies when an agency interprets an ambiguous statute, but here the issue concerns whether the agency followed the required rulemaking process, not statutory interpretation. Non-delegation doctrine, B, is rarely used to strike down agency rules, as courts generally uphold broad congressional delegations unless Congress has given the agency unfettered discretion. Substantial evidence, D, applies mainly in formal rulemaking and adjudications, not in informal rulemaking under the APA. Question 2. Employment and labor laws. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges impact workplace policies, a company implements a new performance-based pay structure. Several employees file a lawsuit claiming that the structure disproportionately affects women and minority employees, resulting in low pay compared to their peers. The company argues that the policy is neutral and applies equally to all employees. Under which legal framework would the court most likely analyze this case? A. Disparate treatment under Title Roman of the Civil Rights Act. B. Disparate impact under Title Roman of the Civil Rights Act. C. The Equal Pay Act (EPA), requiring equal pay for equal work. D. The Fair Labor Standards Act (FLSA), regulating minimum wage and overtime. Answer. B. Disparate impact under Title Roman of the Civil Rights Act. Explanation. This question examines employment discrimination law and the difference between disparate treatment and disparate impact claims. Disparate impact, B, occurs when a facially neutral employment practice disproportionately affects a protected class without requiring intent to discriminate. The key case is Griggs v. Duke Power Company, 1971, which established employment practices can be unlawful if they disproportionately burden a protected group and are not justified by business necessity. Disparate treatment, A, requires proof of intentional discrimination, which is not necessary in this case. The Equal Pay Act, C, specifically deals with pay disparities based on gender, but this case involves multiple protected groups. The Fair Labor Standards Act, D, concerns wage and hour laws, not employment discrimination. The company can defend the policy by showing it is job-related and consistent with business necessity, but if a less discriminatory alternative exists, the court may strike it down. Question 3. Criminal law and regulatory compliance. When implementing backup procedures across various financial institutions, a compliance officer at a major bank discovers that several high-level executives have been bypassing internal reporting requirements for large international transactions. A whistleblower reports the issue to the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC), and an investigation reveals that these transactions were designed to circumvent anti-money laundering laws. What is the most relevant federal statute that the executives may have violated? A. Sarbanes-Oxley Act, SOX, addressing corporate financial disclosures and whistleblower protections. B. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, FEPA, prohibiting bribery of foreign officials. C. Bank Secrecy Act (BSA), requiring financial institutions to maintain records and report suspicious transactions. D. RICO, Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, targeting organized crime and fraudulent schemes. Answer: C. Bank Secrecy Act (BSA), requiring financial institutions to maintain records and report suspicious transactions. Explanation: this question requires knowledge of financial regulatory laws and anti-money laundering compliance. The Bank Secrecy Act (BSA) requires banks to maintain detailed records and report large or suspicious financial transactions to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. 31 U.S.C. SSS 53115332. The SEC enforces strict anti-money laundering (ML) compliance, and banks must report transactions over $10,000 for suspicious activity under the Suspicious Activity Report (SAR) requirements. Sarbanes-Oxley Act 8 mainly concerns financial transparency and whistleblower protections, but does not directly regulate money laundering. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act (B) addresses bribery. Foreign officials, not internal banking violations. RICO D is broader, dealing with patterns of organized criminal activity, but the BSA is the most directly applicable statute for banking violations. The executives could face civil and criminal penalties, including fines and imprisonment under the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network (FinCEN) regulations. Question 4. In an environment where different components must interact efficiently under strict regulatory oversight, a dispute arises between a federal regulatory agency and a state government regarding jurisdiction over environmental compliance. The state has enacted stricter pollution control standards than the federal baseline, and a company operating within the state is facing penalties for failing to meet the state's high requirements. The company argues that federal law should preempt state regulation and that compliance with federal standards should be sufficient. The state insists that its regulations are valid because they provide greater environmental protection. Which legal principle best determines the outcome of this case? A. The Dormant Commerce Clause, which prohibits states from unduly burdening interstate commerce. B. The Preemption Doctrine, under which federal law overrides conflicting state laws. C. The 10th Amendment, which reserves powers not delegated to the federal government to the states. D. The Chevron Doctrine, which gives deference to agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. Answer: B. The Preemption Doctrine, under which federal law overrides conflicting state laws. Explanation: this scenario deals with a fundamental principle of federalism, the relationship between federal and state authority. The Preemption Doctrine, based on the Supremacy Clause, Article Omensa Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution, states that when federal law conflicts with state law, federal law takes precedence. However, preemption can be express. Congress explicitly states federal law preempts state law, or implied, when compliance with both federal and state laws is impossible, or when state law stands as an obstacle to congressional objectives. A. Incorrect. The Dormant Commerce Clause limits state laws that burden interstate commerce, but this case focuses on whether federal environmental regulations override stricter state laws, not an undue burden on commerce. C. Incorrect. The 10th Amendment protects state powers, but it does not allow states to enforce laws that contradict federal law if Congress has preempted the field. D. Incorrect. The Chevron Doctrine applies to review of agency rulemaking, but it does not resolve conflicts between federal and state laws. The case outcome depends on whether Congress explicitly preempted stricter state standards or left room for additional state-level regulation. Many environmental laws, like the Clean Air Act, allow states to impose stricter standards if they meet minimum federal baselines. Question 5. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, Congress is debating amendments to an existing financial regulation statute to address recent market failures. Some legislators advocate for a broad delegation of rulemaking authority to the relevant regulatory agency, allowing the agency to define key enforcement parameters. Others argue that such a delegation would be unconstitutional. Which of the following principles governs Congress's ability to delegate legislative power to administrative agencies? A. The non-delegation doctrine, which limits Congress's ability to transfer its legislative authority. B. The major questions doctrine, which prevents agencies from resolving politically significant issues. C. The necessary and proper clause, which permits Congress to enact laws essential to its powers. D. The take care clause, which ensures the President enforces laws faithfully. Answer: A. The non-delegation doctrine, which limits Congress's ability to transfer its legislative authority. Explanation: the non-delegation doctrine stems from Article I, Section 1 of the U.S. Constitution, which vests all legislative powers in Congress. This principle holds that Congress cannot delegate its core legislative function without providing an intelligible principle to guide agency action, as seen in J. W. Hampton, Union Company v. United States. B. Incorrect. The major questions doctrine is related but narrower. It prevents agencies from making broad regulatory decisions of vast economic or political significance without clear congressional authorization. West Virginia v. Epper. C. Incorrect. The necessary and proper clause allows Congress to pass laws enabling the execution of its powers, but it does not justify broad delegation. D. Incorrect. The Take Care Clause requires the President to enforce laws but does not regulate congressional delegation. While broad delegations are common in financial regulation, excessive delegation risks violating the non-delegation doctrine. Question 6. In a case where multiple parties have different objectives and agency issues, a rule that significantly impacts businesses in a regulated industry, the affected companies challenge the rule, arguing that the agency exceeded its statutory authority. The agency claims it acted within its mandate. Which judicial standard will most likely be applied to determine the validity of the agency's action? A. Rational basis review. B. Chevron deference. C. Strict scrutiny. D. Void for vagueness doctrine. Answer: B. Chevron deference. Explanation: Chevron U.S. Inc. v. Natural Resources Defense Council, 1984 established a two-step framework for reviewing agency interpretations of statutes. Has Congress spoken clearly? If the statute is unambiguous, the agency must follow Congress's intent. If ambiguous, is the agency's interpretation reasonable? If reasonable, courts defer to the agency's expertise. A. Incorrect. Rational basis review applies to general constitutional challenges, not agency rulemaking. C. Incorrect. Strict scrutiny is used for fundamental rights or suspect classifications, not agency interpretations. D. Incorrect. Void for vagueness applies to criminal or regulatory statutes lacking clarity, not administrative regulations. This case hinges on whether the agency's interpretation was reasonable under Chevron. Question 7. When implementing backup procedures across various industries, a federal regulatory agency mandates extensive cybersecurity protocols for companies handling sensitive consumer data. A company challenges the rule, arguing that the agency's action imposes excessive compliance costs without statutory authority. Under which legal framework would court assess whether the agency acted within its regulatory power? A. The Administrative Procedure Act, APA. B. The Commerce Clause. C. The Equal Protection Clause. D. The Privileges and Immunities Clause. Answer: A. The Administrative Procedure Act, APA. Explanation: the APA 1946 governs how federal agencies develop and enforce regulations. Under Section 706, courts review whether agency rules exceed statutory authority, are arbitrary and capricious, or violate procedural requirements. B. Incorrect. The Commerce Clause allows Congress to regulate interstate commerce but does not control agency rulemaking. C. Incorrect. The Equal Protection Clause applies to discriminatory laws but does not govern agency rulemaking. D. Incorrect. The Privileges and Immunities Clause concerns state-to-state discrimination, not agency regulations. A company challenging cybersecurity regulations must prove the agency overstepped its authority under the APA. Question 8. During a critical transition period where existing processes need to be evaluated and refined, a federal agency issues a new regulation that conflicts with an existing state law governing environmental protection standards. The state argues that its law should take precedence as it imposes stricter pollution controls. How should the conflict be resolved under the Supremacy Clause of the U.S. Constitution? A. The state law prevails because it provides greater environmental protection than the federal regulation. B. The federal regulation prevails because it was enacted under Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce. C. Both laws can be enforced simultaneously as long as they do not directly contradict each other. D. The courts must defer to agency interpretation under the Chevron doctrine. Answer: B. The federal regulation prevails because it was enacted under Congress's authority to regulate interstate commerce. Explanation: the Supremacy Clause Article Romans 6 Clause 2 of the U.S. Constitution establishes that federal law takes precedence over state law when there is direct conflict. In this case, the federal agency's regulation supersedes the state law because Congress has broad powers under the Commerce Clause to regulate environmental protections that impact interstate commerce. The Chevron doctrine, which requires courts to defer to reasonable agency interpretation of ambiguous statutes, applies to statute interpretation but does not determine whether state or federal law prevails. Although states can impose stricter regulations, they cannot contradict or interfere with federal mandates. Question 9. In an environment where different components must interact, a new law is enacted that significantly changes the process for approving new pharmaceutical drugs. Previously, the Food and Drug Administration (FDA) required extensive clinical trials before approval. Under the new law, pharmaceutical companies can request an expedited review process if they provide preliminary safety data. What is the most likely legal implication of this change? A. It increases the risk of liability for pharmaceutical companies due to reduced testing requirements. B. It violates the Due Process Clause because it weakens regulatory oversight. C. It is unconstitutional because it limits judicial review of FDA decisions. D. It allows states to impose additional testing requirements beyond federal standards. Answer A. Increases the risk of liability for pharmaceutical companies due to reduced testing requirements. Explanation. Expedited drug approval processes often reduce the time required for clinical trials, which can lead to increased liability for pharmaceutical companies if adverse effects emerge after approval, while the FDA has authority to regulate drug approvals under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, reducing testing requirements. Increases the risk of lawsuits under product liability law. The change does not violate due process as long as it follows legislative procedures and it does not inherently limit judicial review. Additionally, the preemption doctrine generally prevents states from imposing additional testing requirements beyond federal standards. Question 10. When developing a solution that must address opposing needs, Congress passes a statute requiring businesses to meet cybersecurity standards to protect consumer data. However, a regulatory agency issues rules that allow businesses flexibility and compliance based on risk assessments. A lawsuit is filed challenging the agency's authority to weaken the congressional mandate. What legal principle will determine the outcome? A. The Major Questions Doctrine, which prevents agencies from making significant policy decisions without clear congressional authorization. B. The Chevron Doctrine, which allows agencies to interpret ambiguous statutes if their interpretation is reasonable. C. The Non-Delegation Doctrine, which prohibits Congress from delegating legislative power to agencies. D. The Void for Vagueness Doctrine, which invalidates laws that are too ambiguous. Reasonable enforcement. Answer A. The Major Questions Doctrine, which prevents agencies from making significant policy decisions without clear congressional authorization. Explanation. The Major Questions Doctrine applies when an agency makes a significant policy decision without explicit congressional authorization. Courts have increasingly used this doctrine to strike down regulations that fundamentally alter statutory intent. The Chevron doctrine applies when statute language is ambiguous, but in cases of major policy shifts, courts do not automatically defer to agencies. The non-delegation doctrine is rarely invoked but limits Congress from delegating purely legislative powers to agencies. The Void for Vagueness Doctrine applies primarily in criminal law and constitutional due process cases, making it less relevant here. Question 11. In a situation where formal requirements conflict with practical implementation, a state enacts a new law requiring online platforms to verify the identity of all users to prevent fraudulent activity. However, federal privacy laws restrict how personal data can be collected and stored. How should courts analyze this conflict? A. The federal law preempts the state law under the Supremacy Clause. B. The state law prevails because it is aimed at preventing fraud, a traditional state concern. C. The laws coexist because they serve different objectives. D. The matter must be decided through congressional amendment. Answer A. The federal law preempts the state law under the Supremacy Clause. Explanation. When state and federal laws conflict, the Supremacy Clause dictates that federal law takes precedence. In this case, federal privacy regulations, such as a DDR EUPA if applicable in the U.S., place strict limits on the collection and storage of personal data. A state cannot enact a conflicting requirement that forces businesses to violate federal law. Courts will likely find the state law preempted under federal authority over data privacy and commerce. Question 12. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in compliance enforcement, a government agency revises its regulatory framework to allow businesses to self-report minor violations in exchange for reduced penalties. Critics argue that this approach weakens enforcement. What key legal principle is most relevant in evaluating the constitutionality and effectiveness of this policy? A. The Administrative Procedure Act, a power which governs how agencies create and enforce regulations. B. The Equal Protection Clause, which requires uniform application of laws to all businesses. C. The Takings Clause, which prevents the government from depriving businesses of property without compensation. D. The Federalism Doctrine, which limits federal power over state enforcement agencies. Answer A. The Administrative Procedure Act, a power which governs how agencies create and enforce regulations. Explanation. The APA establishes the framework for how federal agencies develop and enforce regulations. It requires public notice, comment periods, and adherence to statutory intent when revising enforcement policies. Allowing businesses to self-report violations in exchange for reduced penalties is a form of prosecutorial discretion, which agencies have broad authority to implement. The Equal Protection Clause applies primarily to cases of discrimination, not regulatory enforcement. The Takings Clause concerns the government seizing property, which is not at issue here. The Federalism Doctrine pertains to the division of power between state and federal governments, but is unrelated to agency enforcement discretion. Question 13. During a seamless transition where continuity must be maintained, a state government adopts stricter environmental regulations that exceed federal standards. A business association challenges the law, arguing that it violates the Dormant Commerce Clause. What must the court consider in determining whether the state law is unconstitutional? A. Whether the law discriminates against interstate commerce or imposes an undue burden on out-of-state businesses. B. Whether Congress has explicitly authorized states to regulate in this area. C. Whether the law conflicts with existing federal environmental statutes. D. Whether the state has a compelling interest in environmental protection. Answer A. Whether the law discriminates against interstate commerce or imposes an undue burden on out-of-state businesses. Explanation. The Dormant Commerce Clause prevents states from passing laws that unduly burden or discriminate against interstate commerce. Courts will analyze whether the state law imposes economic protectionism or disadvantages out-of-state businesses. If the regulation is neutral and applies equally to all businesses, it is likely to withstand constitutional scrutiny. While Congress can authorize states to regulate, the lack of such authorization does not automatically render state laws unconstitutional. Conflict with federal laws is a preemption issue, not a Dormant Commerce Clause issue. Lastly, having a compelling interest in environmental protection does not automatically justify a burdensome regulation under commerce-related constitutional principles. Question 14. When implementing new protocols in a shared environment, a federal agency enacts a regulation that requires telecommunication companies to collect and store customer metadata for national security purposes. A lawsuit is filed challenging this rule under the Fourth Amendment. What legal precedent is most relevant in determining whether the rule is constitutional? A. Katz v. United States, 1967, which established the reasonable expectation of privacy standard. B. New York v. United States, 1992, which limited federal overreach into state affairs. C. Gonzalez v. Raich, 2005, which upheld broad congressional power under the Commerce Clause. D. McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, which affirmed the necessary and proper powers of Congress. Answer A. Katz v. United States, 1967, which established the reasonable expectation of privacy standard. Explanation. Katz v. United States introduced the reasonable expectation of privacy standard, which is crucial in Fourth Amendment cases. The lawsuit challenging government-mandated metadata collection will focus on whether individuals have a reasonable expectation of privacy over their digital data. If so, what? Collection may be unconstitutional. New York v. United States is a federalism case unrelated to privacy rights. Gonzalez v. Raich concerns the Commerce Clause, not data privacy, and McCulloch v. Maryland deals with Congress's broad powers but does not specifically address privacy issues. Question 15. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges arise, a new federal statute grants broad discretionary powers to an executive agency to enforce consumer protection laws. A business lobby challenges this delegation of power, arguing it is unconstitutional. What legal doctrine is most relevant in this challenge? A. The non-delegation doctrine, which limits Congress from transferring legislative powers to agencies. B. The Chevron doctrine, which allows courts to defer to agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. C. The major questions doctrine, which prevents agencies from making significant policy decisions without clear congressional authorization. D. The rational basis test, which applies to equal protection challenges. Answer A. The non-delegation doctrine, which limits Congress from transferring legislative powers to agencies. Explanation. The non-delegation doctrine holds that Congress cannot delegate its legislative powers without providing an intelligible principle to guide the agency's discretion. If statute grants overly broad enforcement powers without clear guidelines, courts may find it unconstitutional. The Chevron doctrine concerns how courts interpret ambiguous regulations, not whether delegation itself is lawful. The major questions doctrine applies to significant agency decisions beyond congressional authorization but does not address delegation as directly as the non-delegation doctrine. The rational basis test is standard used in equal protection cases, which is unrelated here. Question 16. While investigating a complicated issue between different jurisdictions, Congress passes a law that allows administrative agencies to impose fines for workplace safety violations. A company challenges a fine, arguing that only courts should have the authority to impose penalties. What constitutional principle is most relevant in evaluating the agency's power? A. The Due Process Clause, which guarantees fair procedures before deprivation of property. B. The Necessary and Proper Clause, which allows Congress to delegate enforcement mechanisms. C. The Commerce Clause, which grants Congress power to regulate workplace safety. D. The Separation of Powers Doctrine, which limits executive agencies from imposing penalties. Answer A. The Due Process Clause, which guarantees fair procedures before deprivation of property. Explanation. The Due Process Clause ensures that agencies provide fair notice and an opportunity to challenge penalties before imposing fines. While agencies have broad enforcement authority, courts review whether administrative fines comply with due process protections. The Necessary and Proper Clause justifies Congress's ability to regulate workplace, but it does not resolve procedural fairness concerns. The Commerce Clause allows Congress to enact workplace safety laws, but agency fines must still be constitutional. The Separation of Powers Doctrine does not prohibit agencies from issuing fines as long as there is judicial review available. Question 17. During a major transformation where existing methods require revision, a state amends its election laws to require additional identification verification for absentee ballots. A civil rights group challenges the law, claiming it disproportionately affects certain groups. What standard of review will the court most likely apply? A. Strict scrutiny, because voting is a fundamental right. B. Intermediate scrutiny, because election laws affect the public interest. C. Rational basis review, because voting regulations are left to the states. D. Chevron deference, because election regulations are subject to federal agency oversight. Answer A. Strict scrutiny, because voting is a fundamental right. Explanation. Courts apply strict scrutiny when evaluating laws that affect fundamental rights, such as voting. The state must show that the law serves a compelling government interest and is narrowly tailored. Intermediate scrutiny applies mainly to gender discrimination cases. Rational basis review applies to non-fundamental rights, making it inappropriate here. Chevron deference concerns agency regulations, not constitutional challenges. Question 18. In a critical decision-making scenario requiring meticulous attention to detail, Congress enacts a new law increasing financial disclosure requirements for political campaigns. A candidate challenges the law, claiming it violates the First Amendment. What legal precedent is most relevant in evaluating this claim? A. Citizens United v. FEC 2010, which ruled that political spending is a form of protected speech. B. McCulloch v. Maryland 1819, which established federal supremacy over state law. C. Gideon v. Wainwright 1963, which guaranteed the right to an attorney in criminal cases. D. New York Times v. Sullivan 1964, which set standards for defamation lawsuits. Answer A. Citizens United v. FEC 2010, which ruled that political spending is a form of protected speech. Explanation. In Citizens United v. FEC, the Supreme Court ruled that restrictions on independent political expenditures by corporations and unions violate the First Amendment. If the new financial disclosure law places excessive burdens on campaign spending or restricts political speech, it could be challenged. Unconstitutional under this precedent. McCulloch v. Maryland is unrelated, as it deals with federal versus state powers. Gideon v. Wainwright concerns the right to an attorney in criminal cases. New York Times v. Sullivan applies to defamation, not campaign finance law. Question 19. While coordinating strategic efforts in an evolving landscape, a federal agency issues a regulation requiring large corporations to meet specific environmental sustainability targets. A trade group challenges the rule, arguing that the agency overstepped its authority. What legal doctrine will most likely guide the court's decision? A. Chevron deference, which allows courts to defer to agency interpretations of ambiguous laws. B. The non-delegation doctrine, which limits Congress from transferring legislative power. C. The major questions doctrine, which prevents agencies from making significant policy decisions without clear congressional authorization. D. The Dormant Commerce Clause, which restricts states from interfering with interstate commerce. Answer. C. The major questions doctrine, which prevents agencies from making significant policy decisions without clear congressional authorization. Explanation. The major questions doctrine applies when an agency makes a policy decision of vast economic or political significance without explicit authorization from Congress. If the environmental regulation has major financial implications for corporations, courts may reject the rule. Congress has clearly delegated such authority. Chevron deference applies to routine regulatory interpretations, but it is unlikely to apply to a major policy shift. The non-delegation doctrine restricts broad grants of power to agencies, but is less commonly used than the major questions doctrine. The Dormant Commerce Clause concerns state regulations affecting interstate commerce, which is not relevant in this federal agency case. Question 20. Amid an atmosphere of ongoing change and uncertainty, a state government enacts a law requiring social media platforms to disclose their content moderation policies. A technology company sues, claiming the law violates the First Amendment. What legal issue is most relevant in this case? A. Compelled speech, which prevents the government from forcing private entities to communicate certain messages. B. Prior restraint, which restricts government censorship of speech before publication. C. Content-neutral restrictions, which regulate speech without favoring specific viewpoints. D. The Establishment Clause, which prohibits the government from endorsing religion. Answer A. Compelled speech, which prevents the government from forcing private entities to communicate certain messages. Explanation. The First Amendment's compelled speech doctrine prevents the government from forcing individuals or private companies to express messages they do not wish to convey. If the law mandates that social media platforms disclose how they moderate content, it could force companies to speak against their will, making it unconstitutional. Prior restraint applies to government censorship before speech occurs, which is not the issue here. Content-neutral restrictions regulate time, place, and manner of speech, not forced disclosures. The Establishment Clause is unrelated, as this case does not involve religion. Question 21. In a fast-paced and high-pressure scenario demanding immediate solutions, Congress passes a law imposing nationwide minimum sentencing guidelines for drug offenses. The defendant challenges the law, arguing it violates the Eighth Amendment. What must the court consider in determining the law's constitutionality? A. Whether the sentences are disproportionate to the crime and constitute cruel and unusual punishment. B. Whether the law exceeds Congress's power under the Commerce Clause. C. Whether state governments have the right to opt out of federal sentencing guidelines. D. Whether the law was passed through the correct legislative process. Answer A. Whether the sentences are disproportionate to the crime and constitute cruel and unusual punishment. Explanation. The Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, meaning courts will examine whether the mandatory minimum sentences are excessively harsh relative to the crime. While Congress has broad authority under the Commerce Clause, this case centers on punishment fairness, not federal power. States cannot opt out of federal laws, apply nationwide. While legislative process validity is important, the central issue here is whether the punishments violate constitutional protections. Question 22. During a crucial moment requiring immediate adaptation, the city passes an ordinance banning street protests near government buildings. Civil rights groups challenge the law. What legal principle will most likely determine the case's outcome? A. The time, place, and manner doctrine, which allows restrictions on speech as long as they are content neutral and narrowly tailored. B. The right to petition, which protects individuals from government retaliation for expressing grievances. C. The Equal Protection Clause, which requires laws to be applied fairly to all citizens. D. The Due Process Clause, which guarantees fair legal procedures. Answer A. The time, place, and manner doctrine, which allows restrictions on speech as long as they are content neutral and narrowly tailored. Explanation. Governments can regulate speech in public spaces using content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions, but they must prove the regulation is necessary and narrowly tailored. If the city's ordinance bans all protests near government buildings without providing alternative channels for speech, courts rule it unconstitutional. The right to petition protects against government retaliation, but that's not the primary issue here. The Equal Protection Clause applies when laws target specific groups, which is not the case here. The Due Process Clause ensures fair legal procedures but does not govern speech restrictions. Question 23. During a major transformation where existing methods are being overhauled, a company implements an artificial intelligence (AI) driven hiring system to screen job applicants. Some rejected candidates argue that the system disproportionately excludes individuals from certain racial and ethnic backgrounds. What legal framework is most relevant in evaluating this claim? A. Title Roman of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. B. The Equal Pay Act, which ensures wage equality based on gender. C. The Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, which prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities. D. The Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA, which regulates minimum wage and overtime. Answer A. Title Omen of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Explanation. Title Roman of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibits employment discrimination, including practices that result in disparate impact, meaning that even if hiring system is neutral on its face, it may still be illegal if it harms protected class. AI-driven hiring systems have been scrutinized for inadvertently reinforcing biases based on historical data and algorithmic design. The Equal Pay Act deals with gender-based wage disparities, which is not the focus here. The ADA covers disability discrimination, while the FLSA concerns wages and work hours, making them irrelevant to this hiring bias claim. Question 24. When scaling up operations that experience significant legal scrutiny, a pharmaceutical company seeks expedited FDA approval for a new drug by using an emergency use authorization, EUA. However, consumer safety groups challenge the approval, arguing that it bypasses critical testing requirements. What key legal and regulatory considerations will determine the outcome of this dispute? A. The balance between public health emergencies and the FDA's statutory authority under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act (FDA). B. The takings clause of the Fifth Amendment, which prevents the government from seizing private property without just compensation. C. The Sherman Antitrust Act, which regulates monopolistic practices in the pharmaceutical industry. D. The Copyright Act, which protects intellectual property related to formulations. Answer A. The balance between public health emergencies and the FDA's statutory authority under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act (FDA). Explanation. The FDA's emergency use authorization (EUA) process is governed by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act (FDA), which allows for expedited approval during public health emergencies if benefits outweigh risks. The legal challenge likely hinges on whether the FDA properly exercised authority and followed appropriate safety measures. The takings clause is irrelevant as no property is being seized. The Sherman Antitrust Act applies to anti-competitive behavior, not drug approvals. The Copyright Act concerns intellectual property rights, which are unrelated to this regulatory dispute. Question 25. In a multi-location scenario where consistency requirements vary by jurisdiction, an e-commerce company faces lawsuits after implementing dynamic pricing algorithms that change based on users' locations and browsing history. Plaintiffs claim the pricing model results in unfair discrimination. What legal principles will courts consider when evaluating this case? A. Consumer protection laws, including unfair trade practices statutes and potential violations of price discrimination regulations. B. The Equal Protection Clause, which prevents government discrimination against individuals. C. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which governs corporate financial disclosures and fraud prevention. D. The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act (FEPA), which regulates bribery and corruption involving foreign officials. Answer A. Consumer protection laws, including unfair trade practices statutes and potential violations of price discrimination regulations. Explanation: Courts will analyze consumer protection laws at both the state and federal levels to determine whether dynamic pricing unfairly disadvantages certain customers. The Robinson-Patman Act, a federal price discrimination law, could apply if the pricing scheme favors some groups over others without legitimate business justification. The Equal Protection Clause applies to government actions, not private businesses. The Sarbanes-Oxley Act is relevant for corporate fraud and financial reporting, not pricing strategies. The FEPA governs foreign bribery, making it irrelevant to domestic pricing concerns. Question 26. While investigating a complicated issue between different jurisdictions, a state government passes a law banning social media companies from moderating political content. A tech company sues, arguing the law violates the First Amendment. What is the primary legal issue in this case? A. Whether the state law violates the First Amendment by compelling private companies to host speech against their will. B. Whether the state has the authority to regulate internet service providers under the Commerce Clause. C. Whether the law constitutes an unreasonable search and seizure under the Fourth Amendment. D. Whether the law violates the Supremacy Clause by conflicting with federal regulations. Answer A. Whether the state law violates the First Amendment by compelling private companies to host speech against their will. Explanation: The First Amendment protects against government-imposed restrictions on speech but does not generally apply to private companies' content moderation policies. Courts have ruled that forcing private platforms to host speech amounts to compelled speech, which violates the First Amendment. The Commerce Clause concerns regulation of interstate commerce, which is secondary to the First Amendment issue here. The Fourth Amendment applies to searches and seizures, not content moderation. The Supremacy Clause could be relevant if the law conflicts with federal regulations, but the First Amendment remains the central constitutional issue. Question 27. During the introduction of new methods where coordination between agencies is required, the federal government launches a nationwide digital ID system for accessing public services. Privacy advocates challenge the system, citing constitutional concerns. What key legal doctrines will influence the court's decision? A. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures and the right to information or privacy. B. The Establishment Clause, which prohibits government endorsement of religion. C. The Sixth Amendment, which guarantees the right to fair trial. D. The Privileges and Immunities Clause, which prevents states from discriminating against out-of-state residents. Answer A. The Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and seizures and the right to information or privacy. Explanation: The Fourth Amendment protects against government overreach in collecting personal data, and courts have recognized right to information or privacy in certain circumstances. If the digital ID system collects or stores personal information without sufficient safeguards, it could be challenged under constitutional privacy rights. The Establishment Clause is irrelevant because this case does not involve religion. The Sixth Amendment concerns criminal trials, which is not applicable. The Privileges and Immunities Clause addresses state discrimination against non-residents, which is unrelated to the federal digital ID system. Question 20. While analyzing the root causes of sequential problems in a regulatory framework, a state legislature passes a law limiting foreign ownership of agricultural land. A multinational corporation challenges the law, claiming it violates the U.S. Constitution. What legal principle is most relevant in evaluating this claim? A. The Dormant Commerce Clause, which restricts states from discriminating against or excessively burdening interstate commerce. B. The Takings Clause, which prevents the government from seizing private property without just compensation. C. The Necessary and Proper Clause, which grants Congress flexibility in executing its powers. D. The Full Faith and Credit Clause, which requires states to recognize each other's legal decisions. Answer A. The Dormant Commerce Clause, which restricts states from discriminating against or excessively burdening interstate commerce. Explanation. The Dormant Commerce Clause prohibits state laws that discriminate against or unduly burden interstate or international commerce. A law restricting foreign ownership of land may be seen as a trade barrier potentially violating this principle. The Takings Clause applies to government confiscation of property. Not the issue here. The necessary and proper clause is a federal power doctrine not relevant to state laws. The full faith and credit clause concerns recognition of legal judgments across states, which is unrelated to property ownership laws. Question 29. In a high-stakes environment where multiple challenges intersect, a federal agency enacts a rule requiring health insurers to cover an experimental medical treatment. A private insurance company argues the rule exceeds the agency's statutory authority. Which legal doctrine will most likely influence the court's decision? A. The Major Questions Doctrine, which limits agency authority in making significant policy decisions without clear congressional approval. B. The Equal Protection Clause, which ensures laws do not discriminate against certain groups. C. The Rational Basis Test, which assesses whether law is reasonably related to legitimate government interest. D. The Establishment Clause, which prohibits government endorsement of religion. Answer A. The Major Questions Doctrine, which limits agency authority in making significant policy decisions without clear congressional approval. Explanation. If a federal agency unilaterally mandates insurance coverage for an experimental treatment, courts may apply the Major Questions Doctrine, requiring clear congressional authorization for such a major economic policy decision. The Equal Protection Clause applies to discriminatory, which is not relevant here. The rational basis test evaluates legislative decisions, but this case concerns agency authority. The Establishment Clause is unrelated, as this case does not involve religion. Question 30. During a comprehensive review of a process that needs improvement, a city imposes a curfew on minors after rise in juvenile crime. Civil liberties groups argue the law is unconstitutional. What must the court consider in deciding this case? A. Whether the curfew law violates minors' fundamental rights under the Due Process Clause. B. Whether the law constitutes a taking under the Fifth Amendment. C. Whether the law violates the Contracts Clause, which prohibits states from interfering with private agreements. D. Whether the law contradicts federal sentencing guidelines. Answer A. Whether the curfew law violates minors' fundamental rights under the Due Process Clause. Explanation. Minors, while not having all the rights of adults, still have constitutional protections under the Due Process Clause. Courts must balance public safety concerns against the fundamental rights of minors, such as freedom of movement. The Takings Clause applies to property seizure, which is not relevant. The Contracts Clause concerns state interference. Private contracts, which does not apply here. Federal sentencing guidelines govern criminal sentencing, not city curfews.